So tonight we're going to discuss recreation economies broadly, and that's centered by the Connecticut River Valley specifically. The Connecticut River serves as a recreational outlet and central part of many local economies along the Connecticut River Valley. It also serves as an area of potential economic growth. How is the recreation economy shaping and being shaped by our local river economies now and into the future? Well, I think we might get some more information about all that from our speakers, Alex Belenz, Shannon Rogers, and Josh Hanford. So what we're going to do tonight, I'm going to give a chance for each of our speakers to talk, and then feel free to, each speaker is going to have a slightly different focus on what they're going to present. So we'll take a few questions after each speaker shares their information, and then we'll also hopefully leave a good amount of room at the end to kind of pull everything together and have a group discussion. But don't be shy to throw your comments in the chat or raise your hand as we go along. So with that, I'm just going to get started with our first speaker. My old colleague, Alex Belenz, is going to provide an overview of the recreation economy. He's an associate analyst and planner with SE Group. He's going to talk about how outdoor recreation is defined, approaches for defining outdoor recreation more broadly, and then some approaches for linking river recreation and local economies. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and let Alex take it on.
All right, let's get this shared. Can everybody see this? Okay, great. Thanks, Olivia. Super pumped to be here tonight. I know some of you who I see in the audience. I've had a lot of involvement with CRJC over the years. I've worked with a number of the subcommittees. I was on the executive board for a bit, and I live in White River Junction, so I'm right down in the heart of the Connecticut River Basin. I've had a lot of fun times recreating on and adjacent to the Connecticut River, and so really pleased to be part of this discussion tonight. And yeah, my presentation is just going to kind of, I think instead of talking about the Connecticut River economy specifically, it's going to be a little bit more of a tee up for how do we think about outdoor recreation, the outdoor recreation economy. And I think you all, with your knowledge of your communities and the river itself, can think about, you know, how some of these things may be applied in your towns and your work, that sort of thing. So that's my goal for my presentation. And we can get into it now. Just a little bit about me. I mentioned I worked with CRGC a lot. I currently work with a consultant called SE Group. We're a planning design firm. Our office is in Burlington. We do a lot of work around outdoor recreation. We work a lot with ski industry, with public land managers, with towns on issues of outdoor recreation, access, trail development, economic development. Kind of our central focus as a firm is outdoor rec. So well within our wheelhouse to be here tonight. And I'm going to kick it off with a fun intro slide. This was a day I had on the Connecticut River with a bunch of friends a few summers ago. We floated down in various vessels from Sumner Falls down to Harpoon Brewery. So there's some immediate parallels there you can think of in terms of outdoor rec and economic impact. We spent money at the brewery. We bought snacks. We drove there. It was a great day. And so what I'm hoping to talk about a little bit is these kinds of, you know, direct connections from outdoor recreation activity to economy, but then I also want to zoom out a little bit and think about this topic a little bit more broadly. But if you've never floated the river from Sumner Falls down to Harpoon Brewery, I highly recommend it. It's a really nice trip. So I'm going to start really high level and try not to get too nerdy too quick, but wanted to first start with how we define outdoor recreation. This is not a resolved question. There's a lot of different ways that you can define it, depending on the context that you're working in, your region, that sort of thing. But there's different approaches that different agencies and entities have taken to this. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of that. One is there's the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is in the Department of Commerce, and they've recently started tracking outdoor recreation economic impact at a very high level, nation and state level. So they're operating right now with kind of two definitions of outdoor recreation. One is what they're calling a comprehensive definition, which is all recreational activities undertaken for pleasure that occur outdoors. And then they have a more conventional definition, which is those same parameters, but also introducing the idea of intentional physical exertion being part of outdoor recreation. So that's kind of two sides of the same coin in terms of how you could think about outdoor rec. Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative, they introduced the idea of kind of leisure and therapeutic activities being part of outdoor recreation. So that can mean a lot of different things. Reading a book by a stream, that might fall within that definition. A pretty inclusive approach to it. Florida Department of Environmental Protection, I thought they have an interesting way of approaching it. They have resource-based outdoor recreation, which is activities that are more centered around being in a natural setting. And then they have user-oriented outdoor recreation, which is activities that are occurring outside, but could maybe happen anywhere if the facilities are built and provided. So that could be something like road biking, or maybe even, playing basketball in a park or something like that. So also different ways of looking at it. There's also, different legal definitions. So, if you dig into the New Hampshire RSAs, if you look at the landowner limited liability statutes, they talk about all these different activities that could be included in outdoor recreation for the purposes of, permitting access to private land for recreation. So they have things like bouldering, sightseeing, and removing fuel wood in that definition. So a lot of different ways of approaching this. So I just wanted to set that stage and say, there's a lot of different ways to think about it. Each kind of context and situation is going to maybe call for thinking about this a little bit differently. So with all that in mind, maybe we have a working definition of river recreation. This is kind of maybe what I think of as river recreation. You might think about it a little bit differently, but basically if you're in, at, or along a river or stream, and you're there intentionally with the purpose of, being at that river for fun or for spiritual renewal or for hanging out with a close friend, I would consider that recreation. And there's a lot that could fall in that. That could be on a big motorized boat. That could be just, finding a little rock to sit on and hanging out for a bit, skipping stones. That's how I would look at it, but others may think about it a little bit differently. Also, just useful to think about defining what we mean when we talk about economy. So it's good to remember that, economy refers to, it's not just kind of markets and individual transactions. It's kind of the way that we as a society allocate and distribute scarce resources within a society. So it speaks to broader social, political, built environment, and other considerations beyond just the transaction of money. So good thing to keep in mind as we think about the outdoor recreation economy and what that specifically means. And I'll get into that in a little bit in a second. So last of the definition slides, again, outdoor recreation economy. Do we have a specific definition of that that's universally agreed upon? I would say no. But we can think about some of the different aspects that kind of roll up into the outdoor recreation economy. So there's the activities themselves. We could go and do a really long list of what those might be, but everything, I would say, from biking to fishing, hunting, bird watching, I would argue gardening, things of that nature, those different activities. We can think about the direct economic impacts that those activities have. So purchasing of equipment for those activities, if you are paying to participate, if you're going to a ski resort, you're paying to participate. There's a direct economic impact associated with that. We can do some basic math and look at, the amount of spending that's generated by those activities, the jobs that are supported, taxes that are generated. And that can include things like purchasing food or gas or lodging as part of travel to participating in outdoor recreation. There's a lot that can go into there. What gets harder to define are some of those more indirect impacts. There could be quite a number that are associated with that. But when we think about quality of life and health, both physical and mental. There's definite economic components to that. So under quality of life, that can be everything from having an employer who's employing people in a place that is fun and safe to live and attractive because they have outdoor recreation offerings that encourage people to stay there or encourage people to move there. There's a lot that can kind of feed up into that. Infrastructure and services. So, outdoor recreation activities largely occur on some sort of infrastructure, whether that's a trail, a path, a road, a boat launch, a golf course. All of that could be kind of categorized under infrastructure, and there are inputs and outputs to keeping that built and maintained. Services as well that include things like programming, kids summer camps. That could be learn to ski programs. It could be the plowing roads so that people can get to that's again can be pretty broad, but thinking about where do people live in relation to where they recreate. Do people recreate, is that a form of community for them, or do they do recreation on their own? Is it an escape for them? So there's a lot of things that can really roll up into how we think about an outdoor economy. So it's a complex topic, and I'm going to next couple slides talk about if we're thinking about analyzing an outdoor economy, we can think about how to do that in a somewhat simple way, and we can think about how we do that in a broader and more complex way. So I'm just going to spend a slide or two talking about economic impact modeling. So this is kind of our basic way in which groups like ours and Shannon's and others might think about economic impact from outdoor recreation activity. And so this is kind of going to that previous slide talking about the direct impact. So this is a model that's just right now is teed up to describe economic impact of a trail-based activity like hiking or biking, but it can apply to really anything where you can get a sense of how many people are participating. So essentially, if you know the number of people who are participating, kind of where they're coming into this activity from, if they're local, non-local, if they're there for the day or if they're there from overnight, and if you have an understanding of their spending profile, so how much does the typical user or participant in this activity spend on different items or services, you can generate a decent understanding of what their direct economic impact would be on things like retail sales, jobs, and tax revenue. So there's different kind of modeling programs and things like that that can take this and spit out some of those outputs. There's either existing research or survey research that can be done to identify some of these spending profiles. So understanding, the typical person who's visiting for the day to go mountain biking at this trail system, they spend a couple bucks on average on food or something like that. So we can, through different levels of research, we can kind of generate some of that understanding. We've done a bunch of this at SE Group. We actually worked with the Mount Scottney Regional Commission a few years ago on a project for the greater Mount Scottney area looking at this. And so we were looking at where we had data for participation in different activities. We were able to generate some stats around total sales activity associated with those different activities, number of jobs supported, and level of tax revenue. So this one I want to highlight because it's specific to the Connecticut River. So this is economic activity associated with the Cornish boat launch, $200,000 or so a year in total sales activity associated with activity at that boat launch. So again, that's kind of that direct impact way of looking at this. But it's worth kind of zooming in and zooming out from that approach as well, because we want to ask ourselves some questions about who is benefiting and what is the level of impact within some of those numbers. So, for example, with the jobs that are supported, are those, what is the wages associated with those jobs and how does that compare to things like cost of living? And questions like who is able to participate in these activities? Is this an activity that has a high barrier to entry due to cost? So great example right now, mountain biking is something that's definitely taking off in popularity. If you want a good quality mountain bike at a new price, you're probably looking at, $1,500 or so to get a decent bike at this point, brand new. So that's a barrier for entry. And so that speaks to maybe some of those programmatic and other elements if you want people to participate and generate economic benefit. We also want to think about demand for the different activities. So, if there is high level of demand, for example, for more accessible or beginner friendly activities, that's an area where we might not be realizing the full economic benefit of an activity because there's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable or able to participate in it. So there's some deeper questions around that. I wanted to just highlight in the bottom corner here a way of thinking about this that's been promoted and used throughout the country. It's this value chain approach that's been promoted by this organization called WealthWorks. And what's showing here is a value chain that they developed around a soup industry. And so thinking about if you're developing and selling soup, there's all these inputs and people and groups that are involved in developing, processing, distributing, and consuming soup. And you can take the same kind of approach for outdoor recreation. So if you think about the participants in outdoor recreation, who are the ones who are generating demand for it and the ones who are generating economic benefit, those folks, they have to live and work somewhere. If you're talking about local economic benefit, they need to be able to afford to live in that community. They need to have a well enough paying job that they actually have time off in order to participate in outdoor recreation. On the flip side, there has to be the trail or other infrastructure that's available for them to recreate on. They need to be able to acquire gear and have that gear serviced depending on their activity. So if we're thinking about mountain biking, which I'm talking about a lot because I really like mountain biking, you have to be able to get a mountain bike. There needs to be a place that can work on mountain bikes. There needs to be people who know how to fix bikes. Those people need a place to live that they can afford in order to have a stable workforce. So there's a lot of things that roll up into this. And I think my broader point with thinking about the outdoor economy is that you can't run out ahead of kind of the basic economic necessities that come with just a healthy, strong community. So when eventually, the deeper you dig into this, you end up at the same challenges that we talk about across a lot of different areas. We end up talking about affordable housing. We end up talking about wages. We end up talking about quality of life issues, that sort of thing. So it all kind of feeds into that same system in order for us to get economic benefit that really kind of translates across the community. So hopefully that made sense in the way that I'm thinking about it in terms of zooming in and zooming out from just thinking about the strict dollars and cents coming in and out of outdoor rec activities. One example of this approach, this way of thinking, in Coos County, New Hampshire, they did some study and planning around what they called human-powered outdoor recreation. So hiking, biking, cross-country skiing, those types of activities, trying to understand, who all is involved in the economy around these activities. Where are there some of the gaps? Where is there demand? Where are there opportunities to generate more economic benefit? And where are they falling short? And so some of the examples that I brought up already kind of came up in this work. So a big thing was, if you want to build the mountain bike industry in Coos County, you need to have bike shops, you need to have workers, you need to have people who know how to fix bikes. And so that really spoke to the need for job training programs around mountain bike repair and affordable housing. There was a need to just coordinate better amongst different folks who might be involved either directly or indirectly in this industry. So there was a lot of work to set up some social networks that connected even people who were working in like retail and hospitality around, how do we better coordinate our messaging around getting people to come to the region and participate in these activities, getting better information or resources online so that people know where they can come hike, bike, or ski, and thinking about, how can we, if there is demand for this, how do we, foster entrepreneurship around having retail services and repair services and things of that nature to support the activities that we want to have here. So it's a really good comprehensive way to think about this. I recommend checking out on WealthWorks. They have a whole kind of story about how Coos County went through this process to think about outdoor recreation and economic development. It's a really useful way of thinking about this, and it's a good kind of a tangible example that I think a lot of us will be able to relate to. So with that, that's everything I wanted to go through to kind of set the table. I know I talk fast, so I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you ever have questions or anything like that for me following up this event, this is my contact information.
Thank you, Alex. That was really interesting overview with definitions and integrating so many different community elements into this conversation. So thank you very much for that. Does anyone have any questions that you have burning that you'd like to ask Alex at this time?
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Regarding specifically the Connecticut River, I'm assuming the river is safe. And I would think that relating back to your question, thank you for your talk, but relating to your discussion, it would be important for the river to be safe to swim and to be around. So one question I'd have is the river safe, and then related to that, how important and for the society, for the communities around to keep it safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think there may be others on this call who can speak to the safety piece a little bit better than I can. I've always felt comfortable recreating in and along the river. I know there's some concerns in some spots. If you're going right out after a heavy rain, you may not want to be in the water. But a big theme, I think, with river recreation is with, how much work there has been done to clean up rivers and improve water quality and improve safety and get people and provide safe access and accessible access to the river. That's really been a really transformative thing in terms of enabling there to be river recreation. So that's a broad theme around this, is like you can't really get far with river recreation unless you think about the water quality piece. So I would say it's absolutely critical and inseparable from the economic development piece.
I'll throw in that the Wontosticate group, which is the southernmost subcommittee for the Connecticut River Joint Commissions, there was some notice that increased need for emergency services during the COVID-19 pandemic because of the increased use of recreation around the river. And so that was an overlay in terms of safety that I had never thought of before.
Yeah, and I'll just share one quick thought about that. That's one of those, social, infrastructural, and service pieces is totally is emergency services and, having both the educational part of that and having the services available to be able to help people out if they run into trouble when they're recreating. Like, that's a huge value add to have a search and rescue service that can get people if they run into trouble and giving people some level of comfort in going out. So all those things, it all rolls up.
Just a quick question on developing a boat launch river access area within a town. If it's sponsored and promoted by the town, are there increased liabilities for the town if we put people, on the river or at the river from a town sponsor?
I can speak better to New Hampshire than Vermont for this, but in New Hampshire, there's state statute that limits any liability for recreational access like that. As a landowner, you're not liable if people are injured recreating on your land, and that applies to municipalities as well.
Yeah, my question actually is for New Hampshire. Actually, not on the Connecticut, but over on the Penny. Thank you.
Great questions. I think we're going to move along to Shannon Rogers. Shannon Rogers is an associate extension professor and state specialist with the University of New Hampshire. And she's going to speak a little bit more about the characteristics of successful river towns from across the country, which may have some applicability to New Hampshire and New England communities. With that, I'll let Shannon take it away.
Thanks, Olivia. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I was just trying to find the right screen to share here. I just have a few slides with some pictures. I'm going to talk you through some of those characteristics, but I'm really interested in the discussion and appreciate that opportunity to be here with you all tonight on election night. And yeah, just quickly about my experience with the Connecticut River. I was fortunate to be able to encounter it quite a bit when I was an undergraduate at Dartmouth, and walking across there for one of my very first assignments. I did not have a car my whole time there, and I had to get over to the Montshire Museum, and then also some other field trips that we did in class, and it was really nice to be able to do that. I did have some friends who were on the crew team as well, and hearing their stories about going down and chipping away the ice and the Connecticut so they could get their boats in was always fun, and also got to kayak a little bit. And I was on the golf team too, and the golf course was very close to the river. So really appreciate the river from my own personal perspective. But yeah, I wanted to talk tonight about rivers and economic development. And I want to give a shout out to an awesome former master's student at the University of New Hampshire who I had the pleasure of working with on this research, Julia Jones. She had grown up and experienced kind of southern parts of the Connecticut River Valley, and was personally, interested in this topic and looking at those connections and how we could help describe them. So for folks that don't know, UNH Cooperative Extension is the outreach arm of the university system. We have the pleasure and honor of being able to work in communities across the state. We have 4 teams. Our smallest team, but find ourselves to be quite mighty, is the community and economic development team. And most folks, when you think of extension, you might think of food and agriculture, maybe natural resources. Our foresters are pretty well known. We also have a youth and family team, but for about 15 years or so, we have had a community and economic development team. I've been at UNH for about 5 years in that role. In this position that I came into, focusing on nature-based economic development, came out of my colleagues seeing that there was a need in communities across the state to really connect those pieces of having natural assets, but maybe having struggling downtowns, or looking, we have lots of people using our trails. How do we get them to come to our community and spend money? Or how do we get them to stay and maybe start a new business in this community, or encourage their children to stay in the state and work and live and play? So it's been a fun journey so far. And rivers come up all the time, right? We are fortunate in New England to have so many rivers that go through downtowns. And right, that makes sense because many of our communities were former mill towns. So I made this figure a couple of years ago when I was starting to really think about this. We have these former mill towns who are trying to maybe become a river town, or like the good discussion we just had about water quality, because of years of water quality laws and investments and support by volunteers to clean up rivers, so that they could go from being, many of our communities were built with their backs to the rivers because it was a source of energy, but also a source of pollution removal from a particular, community or activity. And luckily we've had all that, good water quality work. Obviously still, things to do in that area for sure, but many communities are seeing an opportunity to embrace or re-embrace the river in a different way by turning and facing the river and becoming more of what's called a river town. Folks may have heard of trail towns, river towns, kind of the same idea, but really where a community's identity around definitely recreation, but also other aspects of, nature-based economic benefits that we look at, like, quality of life, lots of things that Alex was just talking about, recruitment and retention of businesses, particularly as we continue to become an economy that's more service-based, more flexible work situations, having these amenities in your community, such as a river and an accessible river. So, right, I teach community economics at UNH, and actually tomorrow we're going to start talking about the difference between proximity and access. So you may be proximate to something, to a natural asset, but there really has to be some intentional thought to make it accessible. And for those many groups and different uses that Alex was talking about, I think that teed this up really nicely. So there are things that communities can do. We spent some time, and at the end of this little chat that I'm sharing, I will put a couple of links to resources we put together, but we spent some time researching what other river towns across the country were doing and what characteristics they had. So our approach to economic development at UNH Cooperative Extension is really asset-based. What does your community already have, and how can those assets be capitalized in a sustainable way? Or what are the opportunities to improve some of those assets or bring them in? So we often do an assessment of communities with their volunteers. They may be on a conservation commission, they may be on an economic development committee, a chamber of commerce, a downtown committee, a Main Street community. And we will go around with like this list of characteristics and, walk around. We have an app that we also use for some digital kind of spatially located assessment that we can do. But really, we're looking specifically at river towns at these 8 characteristics that we came across. So again, thinking about accessibility. If your river is proximate to your downtown or in your middle of your downtown or nearby, is there a way to either have a boat launch or a dock to put in your paddleboard, your kayak, your canoe? And then even thinking further, is it ADA compliant? We've been doing some work in Rochester, New Hampshire that has the Connecticut River going right through it. And that is a great opportunity for the downtown. In many parts, you don't know that the river is so close by, but there are many businesses that back up. And they have been doing some work. I'll talk about it in a second too, with the river walk. They're starting to build a river walk, but one of the things they wanted to do first was to build an accessible boat launch. So they have put that in, I think it's in between like May and the end of October on the Connecticut River, very accessible to the downtown and also accessible from their high school, Spalding High School. So that is a key characteristic. Another are businesses, obviously, right? If you have a great river and you have a great boat launch, but there's nowhere for people to spend money in your community, then economic impact, will not be seen in your community. They might leave and go to another town to, go to the brewery to get an ice cream, to get lunch. So we have found that particularly businesses that are in for this certain demographic of water recreationists, water users, those are definitely needed to bring that kind of economic vibrancy. This can include casual restaurants, breweries are always up there, coffee shops, a drugstore, or like a place where you could get either first aid or kind of your sunscreen, things like that. Particularly a bike shop or a sporting store, a grocery store, and then local shops. Often the demographics of folks that do this type of recreation or are looking for it in a community are often looking for that local character, that local flair, and want to support either local artisans or, people who are within the community. So they'd keep an eye out for that. Then some things, that probably make sense. Lighting. This comes up a lot, but particularly, with the question about feeling safe and wanting to Again, be accessible, having good quality lighting in streets, parking lots, and if there's a nearby parking garage. And then a park. We see many communities that have, been working their way to be a river town, have utilized a waterfront or park area to be an amphitheater or a place where you can have activities, festivals, maybe you have a farmer's market or you can have concerts. Having all of that in close proximity can really help to, drive that spending that people are doing in the community, keeps them there longer, gives them a reason to come. Maybe there's a river festival or, a race of rubber duckies. Berlin, New Hampshire does a similar to, I don't know if folks have ever been to Waterfire in Providence, Rhode Island, really cool artistic event where they light torches on the river. Berlin has their own version, they call it River Fire, and they have a festival incorporated with it. They light up along the bridges with little lanterns, and they have a 5K and all of these things. So it's a way to bring people to community to stay there longer, and therefore we know people that stay longer if they stay overnight or if they spend a whole day. They're spending in the community in terms of economic impact is going to be higher than if they come for an hour or so. Another thing that's always important is parking. So thinking about, is there parking, especially if you're bringing your kayak or your paddleboard, is there parking nearby, or at least where you can drop off easily and feel like you're going to be able to make it, with your canoe and your kayak transportation system. So something to think about as well. And then a river walk is something that communities, throughout the country have been embracing as a way to bring vibrancy to their downtowns, to kind of re-embrace those rivers now that they look better, they smell better, they feel safer to be around. And we have lots of examples in warmer places like in Florida, and San Antonio has a really famous river walk, but communities in New Hampshire, and we highlight some in our research brief that I'll share in a few minutes, they are thinking about river walks as well. The small town of Wilton, New Hampshire actually has a 1 mile river walk, and it's a nice little opportunity to get out. It doesn't have to be, many miles long. There are some that are longer, but their community wanted to embrace the river and kind of give people maybe something to do at lunchtime, go out, have a place to sit, do a stroll. The city of Nashua has an extensive river walk that they have been working on. They're the only community in New Hampshire that I've seen thus far that actually has a river master plan. So they, have their traditional community master plan, but they have specifically set, goals and done research and made plans for their river, which is really cool. And it's a nice model that I like to share with other communities. I shared it too with the kind of Brattleboro, Hinsdale group that is working on, their bridge project, and they have a greenway project, which is really exciting. So we've been sharing some of these characteristics with them as well, and pertains to a community along the Connecticut River. Another thing that came up in our research that was super interesting and I did not expect to find, but it makes total sense. Sightlines. Okay, if you're walking around a community in their downtown and there's so much knotweed that you can't see over it and see the river, then how will you know the river is there? So there are many, vegetation considerations, invasive species to think about, and really having a plan. So again, another community that is thinking about that is Nashua, and they have a plan for their management. In Rochester, the same thing. They have some plans that they're looking at to kind of maintain some invasive species. And I think it has to be, strategic thinking about sometimes removing vegetation. There are certain things, if it's, a nice tree or something, it can be challenging for the community to figure out which green space to, support. But it does make sense if your priority is to bring people closer to the river and they can't see the river, that can be a challenge. And then, last but certainly not least, probably the most, I definitely agree with what Alex was saying about you cannot have any of these river town aspirations without having good water quality. So partnerships with volunteer monitoring and stewardship groups, as well as state partnerships, I think can be really helpful for making sure that the water is swimmable, fishable, boatable. A few years ago, we did a survey on the top freshwater uses for recreation in New Hampshire, and swimming, boating, and fishing were our top 3, and they bring a lot of economic value to our state. But if the water is not clean, or if you don't feel comfortable in that setting, then that economic value cannot be realized. So I think I just have, so one of the resources I'll share with you too is this idea of how to connect nature into your downtown, and rivers are a huge piece of that. So we have kind of a cartoon theoretical downtown, but I really wanted to highlight some of these areas, a river walk, a dock, an amphitheater, floodplain too. In my work, I think a lot about what we call ecosystem services and kind of other values of nature. So we know that nature can do really cool things for us, like clean water, retain potential floods if there's enough green infrastructure, meaning grass and trees and properly designed kind of landscapes. We see that in Dover, New Hampshire, where they are dealing with a tidal part of the Connecticut River and looking at potential, sea level rise and flooding. They have a riverfront park and a development plan for that area that really considers, incorporating green infrastructure and making sure that flooding is not an issue. Flooding is obviously a consideration for communities that are on a river. We do find that properties close to a river garner a higher home value if they are more than half a mile from the river. So being too close to a river can be, seen as kind of a detriment or a challenge to work with. So those are things to think about as well. Cantilevering bridges on river walks is another way to kind of prepare for some of that, the natural fluctuation you may see and the fluctuations we may see in climate change scenarios. So I think, and then just, some examples of value that rivers can provide. I think I've talked about a lot of them. Alex has as well, but it's really neat to think about them through these lenses of economic development, community vibrancy, and what I was just talking about, the ecosystem services. So I will put those links to the resources in chat, and they also should have my contact information if folks would like to follow up. But I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Shannon. Some really great examples and information resources in there. Are there any questions for Shannon that you'd like to ask right now? Feel free to keep going with the popcorn style. I know I had a burning question, and I was curious about the lighting.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, I went to dark sky lighting, and that being it. Is there a balance there, or are those two different goals? Do they have to be two different towns?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, definitely these characteristics can apply differently in different places, and we never impose them on communities. It's more, that bottom up, what are the priorities of the community? The community may say, like, we don't really care that much about having visitors. We'd rather just, support our quality of life here as residents. And that's the kind of things we want to do. But the lighting is a really good question that came up, I think, particularly around the parking and the boat launch area. So like say you've been out on the river and you come back and the sun is setting. I guess maybe in the summer it's not as much of a concern unless you're out really late, but in those shoulder seasons, just feeling comfortable, exiting the boat launch and then being able to get to your car kind of in a safe way. And we think about that probably in maybe more urbanized areas that have rivers. I think that would have come up, but definitely, yeah, if your goals are to have more of a dark sky experience and folks are fine just remembering to bring their headlamps or whatever to get back to where they've parked or left their car, then that can be a good approach as well.
Thank you. Great. We'll move on to our third speaker, Josh Hanford. He's joining us from the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development. And he's going to talk more about why we need more housing in the correct location to make for stronger communities, especially in the Connecticut River Valley. Go ahead, Josh. Thank you.
Great. Can you see my slide? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to take us in a little bit different direction. As was announced, I'm Josh Hanford, Commissioner of Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development, but I do have a background in natural resource work, and I first moved to Vermont actually to work on a large watershed grant to get the White River Partnership started. I'm on the VORAC board, vice chair of the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economy Collaborative, personally involved in lots of recreational groups, trail groups, and kayak canoe on the White River and the Connecticut River a lot. So I understand the natural resource implications here and the value. And I think that our recreation is driving a lot of economic activity, definitely in Vermont, and places that have high recreational value have high value for where people want to live. And I think what I want to talk about is our challenges with housing and how it does not need to be at odds with environmental protection, natural resource protection, but we have to think about this and build it into a lot of what we're doing and talking about. The pandemic has really highlighted the need for housing all over the country, really, in Vermont, really crisis levels, but this isn't something that happened overnight. We have been underbuilding the housing that our community needs for decades. Few data points here. We were permitting close to 5,000 units of residential housing per year back in the 80s, dropped to an all-time low in 2010 and 11, and we're just slowly starting to build a little bit more. The bar chart on the right is about the net increase in housing supply. And the last decade, we were only increasing our net housing supply by 0.2%. So essentially, natural loss of housing and the new housing we're building was pretty much stagnant. So that has really created a problem that you could see in this chart. Most of our housing was built before 1939. And we're really living in a period where our housing that we have does not meet the current needs. Most of that housing was built for large families, single family homes. Our demographics have changed a lot. And one of the things, kind of related to the two other speakers is this next slide shows sort of where the housing is matching up with jobs. And I don't know what this looks like in New Hampshire, but in Vermont, we have most of our communities have more jobs than homes. So people are driving to work, driving back home because there's a mismatch in the number of homes available to the jobs. So it's hard to see in this chart maybe, but all the green communities have more jobs than homes. And so, we need to sort of reach a little bit better equality here in this regard for the climate change, for the environment, and just people have more quality time to do things like recreate. A lot of times people are ask, why do we have this housing crisis? It's not like our population is growing out of control, and that's true. In Vermont, we've had very modest population growth, but we've had an average of 6% household growth each year. You know, we have smaller and smaller household sizes. So majority of households now are 1 and 2 people. And you have a housing stock that was built before 1939 that was for very large families. And so we have a mismatch in what people need for housing and what we've been building and what we haven't been building. And this all has an impact on prices. You know, home prices are accelerating like crazy. Rents are doing the same because we have a scarcity in housing supply. And really what this results in is people being cost burdened. People are paying too much for their housing. They're becoming, you know, unstable. Really, they're a step away from homelessness if something goes wrong. This graphic is about how many Vermont renters and homeowners pay more than 30% of their household income towards their housing costs. That's a health. If you're paying more than 30%, you're cost burden. If you're paying more than 50%, you're severely cost burdened. And in Vermont, we have 15% of all households that are severely cost burdened, paying more than 50% of their household income on housing. We have a lot of needs and challenges in the housing world, and we sort of put together in our legislative ask last year a way to address this. And it doesn't have to be all building new housing developments everywhere. We can reinvest in what we have. We have a lot of older, dilapidated housing stock that was out of production. We had a housing needs assessment that showed there was like 19,000 housing units that were sub-quality, substandard, didn't meet code. So we should reinvest in that housing first to bring it back online. And we created a program called VHIP, Vermont Housing Improvement Program. We need to invest in supportive housing, you know, mental health services, recovery housing, all sorts of areas, affordable permanent housing. But one area we're starting to see a shift in need also is what's being referred to as the missing middle. We have a lot of long-standing resources to build affordable housing, and then the market will address those wealthier folks that can afford to compete in this hot market. But in the middle, you're sort of pricing out your folks right at 100% of area median income, the sort of heart of your communities, your middle income folks that should be homeowners and starting and raising a family in your community. So with all this need, you know, we went to the legislature and all the federal money that came in, and we had a lot of support for housing development. Just from special pandemic, Vermont allocated $338 million just for housing development. This doesn't include services and rental assistance and other supports through a whole variety of programs. So the message was heard, and we're putting this money to work, building housing all over in the right locations. And so there's some progress, but really, why do we need all this money and what's the problem? It's that we have a math problem when it comes to building housing that people can afford. There's affordable housing, call it capital A affordable housing and lowercase a affordable housing. You know, housing is affordable to all housing is affordable to someone at some income. But when we get to that, you know, we shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your income on housing. Traditionally, when we say affordable housing and where the federal government supports, it's usually for folks' incomes at 60% of area median income and below. Sometimes it goes up to 80%. So in Vermont, you know, a two-person household, $59,000 would be your household income, where any affordable housing assistance sort of cuts off. But what we're seeing is folks all the way up to 120% of area median income, even higher, are not able to find housing, both rental and homes to buy right now. And so this chart is just showing what those are, what someone in the various income levels could pay, not spending more than 30% on rent or purchasing a home, you know, mortgage, property taxes built in. And what we're seeing is more and more of a need for this middle income, which is the 80% AMI to 120% AMI, because we don't have any programs that from the federal government or sources to support this sort of housing development, because the market has typically taken care of that in the past. But with rising costs of supply, labor shortages, added on rules, regulations to housing development, it's become almost impossible to build without some sort of subsidy. So this is a real construction project of building two-bedroom apartments, 20 unit. And you can see here what the maximum rents could be at the different income levels, and then what the annual operating costs are and what ability that property would be able to afford for debt. So typically when we build affordable housing, folks at 60% AMI or below, you essentially get all the money to build the property debt free. It comes in as grants and tax credits and all these complicated schemes to bring money so that they can charge lower rents and have no debt. Well, you could see as you work your way up from someone at 30% AMI able to only afford $620 a month rent up to someone at even 120% of AMI, where the rents can be $2,500 a month. The projects still don't pencil out today. They're still going to have, they still have a $2 million gap in their budget to build that project. The bank is only going to lend on the sort of appraised value to construct that project. So we need these government sort of subsidies and programs to get housing built that people can afford. I'm sure New Hampshire has the same sort of stuff going on where, there's a labor shortage. Major employers are saying, well, we can't hire people. They're turning down jobs because there's no place to live. So we have this sort of robust economy, a lot of it built around recreation in our beautiful states and people coming here, but there's no place for the locals to live because there's no affordable housing. So it really does relate to the earlier discussion we were having, that we can't forget about this side of what we need in our watershed and how we're addressing it at all levels, federal, state, local level. And with all this ARPA money, all the American Rescue Plan Act, or sometimes you hear it referred to as state fiscal recovery funds, it's just been a massive infusion of funding that has a lot of flexibilities associated with it. Every single town in Vermont received money. The state received money. You have flexibility what you do with it. And we're trying to convince communities that they also should be tackling their housing problems by supporting investments with those funds in lots of different ways. There's, you can form housing committees. You can change your land use and your zoning and allow more density. You can support accessory dwelling units, all sorts of examples. One of the areas we're focusing on is, how can you reinvest in existing properties, accessory dwelling units, fit more density into the existing structures you have? Because what we've seen in Vermont, it's pretty true for Northern New England, is that we've seen larger and larger houses with fewer and fewer people in them being built. Vermont has the largest lot size in the country, bigger than Alaska. The Northeast, actually, all of the Northeast, which is the most dense part of the country, the longest settled, we have the largest lot size in the nation, where we use more space than anyone to build our housing on. And it's creating costs and allowing less people to be invited into our communities. And, I'd like to say what we need to do in Vermont is be less exclusive and more inclusive. And it starts with our land use policies. We've had long-standing policies of, we support open space and agriculture, but we've sort of left people out of the equation with the housing we need. We can accommodate both by being smart about it. So a lot of that relates to having proper infrastructure. You need water and sewer in order to have housing density, to have smart growth housing. And we talk a lot about this in Vermont because a lot of our smaller communities don't have water and wastewater infrastructure. Now's the time with all this federal investment to do that, to then change your zoning, your land use policies to allow more dense development, smart growth. Then we can take the pressure off of the backcountry or our working land, so people don't have to buy a 5 or 10 lot to put in their house with their own septic and their own well. And it's sort of a changing mindset that's going to take some time, but it's really critical right now, where people are not finding the ability to live in many of our communities. We have more homeless families than ever, and that's rising. And I think this is really a national problem, but I can only really speak for what's going on in Vermont. And so we're talking about this across all sectors with anyone that will listen, to sort of realize that this does start locally, and it starts with a change of sort of mindset and attitude, that we need to welcome neighbors. We need to welcome more people. It doesn't have to be at the expense of our environment, our natural resources that we value. We can take approaches like in this real street, where these large lots on these single family homes, which have hardly anyone, 1 or 2 people living in them, can fit 7 new lots in, 24 new units, a business. We have to get away from the really professional planning that became really pronounced in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that separated, industry and business are over here, people live over here, and we build these neighborhoods that are meant to drive up with your 2-car garage and a family of 5, and that's how we solve our housing problem. That's not meeting the needs of the future. Older folks, single family folks, divided families with kids. We have people working from home. We have to convert, empty office buildings, older schools and churches that aren't being used into housing. They're already in the places where we have the development, we have the infrastructure, we have the broadband. Instead of building out and trying to provide all those services farther and farther out on large rural sprawl, it's much more efficient way to look at things if we take approach of using the resources we have, being a little bit more dense and intentional about where we plan for our housing, and then providing some resources to help communities do that, because there really is a gap right now. There's a math problem. It's too expensive to build a modest home. And I fear that we can become, with our popularity and our closeness to millions and millions of neighbors down south, that we can become sort of like the Jackson Hole effect, where the only people that live in many of our communities are the super wealthy and the folks that serve in the service industry, because we've built some affordable housing, and our sort of middle class has to keep living farther and farther away from those desirable communities, because we haven't properly planned for the housing that's needed for all income levels. And so, recreation, having great natural resources is a draw. People want to live in those locations, but we can't forget about making room for them and making room for the future residents. Vermont and northern New England, for that fact, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine are all in the same statistic. We have some of the oldest population, the oldest housing stock, the least diverse population, and the largest lots in house sizes. And we have to really think about all those things to be the successful communities of the future, that we want to be inclusive and welcoming. And so, not to leave on a down note, we have made some successes, just in the last couple years with this influx of money and the focus. We've already created over 2,100 new affordable housing units. We're dedicating a third to rehousing folks exiting homelessness. We're going to get another 1,900 built. This is triple the production we saw before the pandemic. And we've successfully housed 1,800 families out of homelessness into permanent housing with subsidy. But in order to really keep this going, this blast of money is not going to be here forever. We sort of have to change the foundational issues that have created this housing shortage for decades. Reduce these barriers, be they permitting and appeals, because we can't control global cost pressures. We can't control, workforce shortages, skilled trade shortages. We can work on all those things, but we've got to really remove any barriers that exist, because we know we need the housing and we know where we need to build it in smart growth locations. Why are we getting in the way of that? It really doesn't speak to the values that a lot of us say we agree with being more inclusive and welcoming younger families and more diversity to our communities to enjoy what we have. And as the climate changes, migration, we're going to see more folks wanting to be here, living in our safe communities with the natural resources we have. And I think we need to welcome them, and we need to plan for it. So a lot of that wasn't as natural economic base as what we talked about, but open to questions, and there is a real connection to all of this. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to ask any questions or give any more information that folks have.
Thank you, Josh. That's really was an interesting information about the housing crisis in Vermont. Definitely New Hampshire is experiencing something similar. And I think tying these pieces together is really important, because the recreation economy attracts people, right? And what we're gonna keeping a strong community development and recreation that is for all the people that we were talking about earlier. You need that housing, and you want to be able to benefit from those natural resources, from the ecosystem services, from the therapeutic, everything that Alex was talking about, and all the different definitions. The benefit of those, where you live is part of what provides.
Absolutely. If you're going to build, denser communities and having more people use our space more efficiently, they need they need easy access to open spaces and recreation for all sorts of health benefits. We know they go hand in hand. And, I think in Vermont, we've done a pretty good job of ensuring there's open spaces and there's recreation and there's access to that. Now we just need to make sure people can, live close by. They don't have to hop in their car and drive an hour, and they can afford to be part of that community.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not an easy question, because we're coming out of not having, CRJC has been so involved in bringing up the water quality of the Connecticut River, and I think people are afraid of that going back. And I don't know, maybe that's just an assumption of mine, but I'm going to step back and let's see if some of our participants here have some questions or have some comments that you'd like to contribute to the conversation.
One thing, if there isn't any right off, one thing I'll add that just is really connected when we talk about, visitors coming, and often they're coming to our region to recreate, enjoy, is sort of this, there's a little bit of a challenging thing going on with lodging properties, short-term rentals, the effects on affordable housing. I get a lot of questions about this, and it's important to understand that it's all connected. We have a lot of folks that'll say, well, it's all the short-term rentals in our community that's causing the affordable housing problem. Everyone's switched to renting their properties on Airbnb and VBRO. They make more money. They don't have to deal with bad tenants. And so that's causing the affordable housing problem. There's some of that. And we have lots of data. We know exactly how many are using for short-term rentals, but it's existed for a long time. Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine all have had a long history of second homes, vacation homes, people visiting. The Airbnb platform has certainly made it easier, and there has been some loss of long-term affordable housing, 2 or 3% in Vermont's case. But on the flip side, we're also seeing sort of traditional lodging properties, hotels and motels that really don't meet the modern standards being actually bought and turned into permanent housing, into affordable apartments. We've probably done 15 purchases in Vermont. So we've taken thousands of units offline that were in the sort of the inventory for visitors and switched it to permanent housing. At the same time, we see traditional housing being converted to lodging properties. So it's all connected. It's where someone is sleeping at night, puts their head, whether it's in a long-term sort of inventory, the short-term. A lot of people are coming and staying in short-term because they're on a nursing contract for 3 months and they can't find a long. So it's connected, and I think it's too easy to find someone that you want to blame for a problem, and it's more complicated than that. So I just put that out there as well.
Yeah, short-term rentals are an opportunity and a challenge for sure.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to our speakers. Really great conversation and things for us to think about for the Connecticut River Valley. I know that I definitely have a lot of homework to do and are going to look at those resources that you guys have shared. I'm going to include that in the follow-up email with the recording so everyone can make sure to take a look at them if you'd like, and share them with your communities, especially your boards and everyone, so they can have those examples and information to help them plan better in their communities for all of these different integrated challenges that we're facing and opportunities for a really wonderful recreation economy that were provided in the Connecticut River Valley. Not uniquely, but definitely special. See some thank yous coming in from the chat, so it's great. Okay, well, happy election day. Good night, everyone.